Hi, and welcome to this pre-recorded version of the OpenUp Masterclass. Enjoy!
Thanks, Remy. Glad to be here and glad to see so many of you dialed in for the power of sleep. So a little bit more about me. I'm basically a sleep nerd. I got into the topic of sleep when I was just 16 years old, and I read a book by Stanford professor Bill Dement. It's called The Promise of Sleep. I can still actually recommend this book decades later. And I studied sleep here in the Netherlands, then in the US, then made a complete switch and joined the business world where I noticed how often sleep is overlooked. And this is why I left the business world 10 years ago to start my own company, focusing on sleep, recovery, and well-being. I'm also adjunct professor at IE Business School and all sorts of different clients, honestly, these days that luckily are starting to focus on sleep. So what's on the agenda for today? We're going to dive into your sleep, why it matters, and then share some tips with you before we go to the Q&A. So first, I would love for you to calculate your own sleep debt, and I'll walk you through this. So there's just two questions to answer. Question A, how many hours of sleep do you get on a weeknight? And a rough average here is fine. And then question B, how many hours of sleep do you need to feel well rested throughout the day? So that tends to be a bit more of a tricky question for people to answer. So I'm going to unpack that a little bit and kind of show you how much sleep is enough indeed. So first, I want to show you the sleep need across the population. This still doesn't tell you, of course, how much sleep you need, but it gives you a sense of how much everybody else is needing. So first of all, you see that it's a normal curve and that the average is about 8 hours of sleep. But of course, it doesn't mean that everybody needs 8 hours of sleep, despite what is often being said in the media. So we do see that most people need about 7 to 9 hours of sleep, and that needing 6 or 10 is indeed really, really rare. So most of you will probably fall between 7 to 9 hours of sleep. Okay, but how are you supposed to feel when you're getting enough sleep? Well, when you're getting enough sleep, you can sit through anything boring without getting sleepy. And that's sometimes a little bit of a surprise to people that that's actually possible, but it is. Maybe in your next boring meeting, think about your sleep debt. But secondly, when you're getting enough sleep, you can wake up without an alarm. So I'd love to see a show of hands of people that actually used an alarm to wake up this morning versus waking up naturally. Okay, so then over to our Friday morning sleep debt. So what I want you to do is multiply A times 5. I see lots of thumbs up for the needing the alarm. So 5 times A minus 5 times B. And I'll give you one hint. It's probably a negative number. I'm going to ask you in a second to throw your number not into the chat, but into a different tool that I'm going to show you in a second. But just one more time, the formula. So your Friday morning sleep debt is 5 times A minus 5 times B. Okay, if you've got that, we're going to move to Slido where you can enter your sleep debt. So you can go to slido.com and enter the code 882020, or you can scan the QR code here directly and enter it directly in there. And why can't it be a positive number? Because you can't sleep more than you need. So if you did get the positive number, you need to change your sleep need a little bit. Okay, so we see people answering immediately. I love it. And the biggest group is the minus 5 to minus 6. So people losing at least an hour a night compared to what they feel they need. And then perhaps worrisome is that the second biggest group, or now the third, is the minus 9 to minus 10. That's really high. And we also have the minus 7 to minus 8 up there. So yeah, these are really, really high numbers, I would say, in terms of the sleep debt. And I'm glad that you dialed in because this is obviously something we want to work on. Now, usually the first question that people have is like, okay, sleep debt, who cares? How much is too much? Well, we know from numerous studies looking at cognitive and motor tasks that people who have a sleep debt of 8 hours perform similarly as people who have a blood alcohol level of 0.1%. That's basically about 3.5 glasses of wine for the average person. So you're legally drunk with these 8 hours of sleep debt, which quite a few of you have or are close to. Okay, so then usually the next question is, oh, Els, I've got like 1,000 hours of sleep debt. What am I going to do? Well, you need to catch up. Firstly, the most kind of best way to try to catch up on your sleep is to go to bed a bit earlier. I know I'm not making myself popular with this advice because who wants to go to bed earlier? But I'll tell you later why that's going to give you the best quality sleep. If that's not an option for you, then you can also take naps. They're highly effective in paying off your sleep debt, and I'll tell you in a second how to take the best nap. And then the least favorite way is to sleep in the morning. Least favorite by sleep experts, but by people, it's usually the favorite way. So if you can't go to bed earlier, can't take naps, then I would recommend for you to sleep in the morning. Why is it less optimal? Because when you sleep in the morning, you're kind of changing your biological rhythm by waking up later. But it's still better than not sleeping in at all when we look at kind of long-term health outcomes. Okay, so naps help too, great, but how can you take the best nap? Well, firstly, the timing really matters. So you want to time your nap well, and the best time is basically right around now, so between 1 to 3 p.m. This is why I usually refuse to give any talk between 1 to 3 p.m. because people are starting to get sleepy. That's not because of your lunch, it's because we all have a dip in our circadian rhythm, and what makes this such a good time to fall asleep. Plus, after your nap, you still have enough time to build up more sleep pressure to still sleep well at night. And this gets me to a bit of a warning label on naps, and that is not useful for everybody. So if you have trouble falling asleep, staying asleep, or waking up too early, then I would not recommend naps. And why not? Because you first want to fix your sleep at night, meaning you need all the sleep pressure that you can get to fall asleep easily and to sleep through the night. So we always want to look at sleep at night first before adding any naps. But assuming that the ones dialing in with the high sleep that are good sleepers, I recommend one of two kinds of naps. Either a shorter one, so about 10 to 15 minutes, where your brain will go into light sleep only, making it very easy to wake up out of, but you'll still get an energy boost for about 3 to 4 hours after the nap. But this is not going to help you to pay off your sleep debt. If you have a high sleep debt, then you want to get the recovery nap. So a recovery nap is a whole sleep cycle, at least 90 minutes. I would recommend setting an alarm 2 hours later and then waking up, or when you wake up, getting up immediately. And this is so good because when you have a full sleep cycle, you're going to get all the different sleep stages and truly catch up on that sleep debt. But of course, this isn't always an option to take these naps during a work day. If you can, that's great. But even at home, I would recommend having earplugs or an eye mask because, of course, other people are still awake and are being noisy. Okay, but then a little bit more about why sleep matters. Why do you want to reduce the sleep debt? Well, first of all, if you remember anything from this talk, I hope it's going to be this one single slide and message. And that's really that sleep is the foundation to performance and well-being. And of course, there's many different elements that are important for performance and well-being. I'll be the first to admit that. It's not just sleep. But sleep is really at the bottom of this pyramid because everything else starts to crumble down when we don't get good sleep. So to give you an example, when people sleep an hour shorter than they're used to, on average, they eat 140 calories more the next day. And they don't just eat more calories, they also crave sugar much more. But then when they eat sugar, they respond differently in terms of their insulin sensitivity. And they almost start to look like a pre-diabetic. Don't worry, you recover as soon as you reduce your sleep debt. But this goes to show that you can have all sorts of lofty goals around healthy nutrition. As soon as you're not getting good sleep, every single cell in your body is going to crave, that bar of chocolate or that pizza. And we see the same thing for physical exercise. So when people are well rested, they're much more likely to exercise. They exercise much more intensely, and they're actually less likely to get injured. And then with stress and sleep, we see this bi-directional relationship. So when people are stressed, they have a harder time sleeping, which I'm sure you'll recognize. But we also see that when people are tired, they're much more sensitive to the same stressor as they would be when they're well rested. So yes, you have a very busy life and you probably have a million things on your to-do list. And now I come in and tell you, you should sleep. But I'm actually making it super easy for you by saying, focus on one thing, I would say at least for the next 2 weeks, and make it sleep. And if you start to improve your sleep, you'll notice that all the other things on this page will become a lot easier. So next, I'd love for you to quickly reflect a bit on how a lack of sleep impacts you. And you can throw it into Slido here. So it's the same code as we just used. You can just go back to the same app. And then maybe tell me what stands out most to you when you haven't had a good night of sleep or a couple of nights of bad sleep. What are you noticing in terms of how that is impacting you the next day, or what is most annoying? Difficulty focusing. Yep. Mood and anxiety. You're just on autopilot. I like how you describe that. More restless. Yep. Concentration, much less focus, stressed, irritated, less alert. Also less lack of motivation. Yeah. More irritated. Your mood, you're feeling annoyed, you're feeling foggy, demotivated, some more headaches. So what I always find really interesting here in all these responses, and we can see them summarized up top because just so many of you are responding, is that if we need to bucket them, we could say, okay, we're seeing all these effects on our IQ, right? So we see concentration, we see lack of focus, lack of alertness, we're just not as productive. But we also see it in EQ, as in we're more anxious, we're more depressed, we're more somber. And then we can really see it also in social intelligence. And with that, I mean that we're much more irritable to the people around us, less patience, we're grumpy towards them, which is obviously having an impact on our relationships. And then finally, the real physical ones, right? So we see here muscle recovery is delayed, or you're nauseous, or you just feel tired, lack of energy, etc. Which is really interesting, right? We take away this one little thing called sleep and maybe not even a full night, and we see everything crumble down. But then I often get this question of okay, sleep is important, but what if I would just cut, 30, 40 minutes a night? Does that have an impact? So back in 2003, Hans van Dongen did this great study where he brought people to the lab for 14 days straight and looked at their cognitive performance every single day. And what we can see here on the y-axis are their performance lapses, meaning that they completely missed something in this task, or they were so slow in responding to it that it was counted as a lapse. And then he had 4 different groups, all getting different amounts of sleep. So let's start with the poor guys and girls in a 0-hour group, because this is pretty extreme. They were only in it for 3 nights, don't worry. Also because after 3 nights, you're already hallucinating, or at least some people are. And we also don't need them in the study any longer because you can see that after 3 all-nighters, you're performing objectively horrible and basically maxing out in terms of poor performance. But if you're getting 4 hours of sleep, well, you do a lot better. But you see that over time, you're still ending up in that same danger territory as the all-nighters. And then 6-hour group, again, we're seeing that they're doing a lot better. But even here, we can see that after about 10 nights of 6 hours, you're performing similarly as someone who just pulled an all-nighter. 8 hours of sleep, by far the best group. We do see them deteriorate a bit in that second week. And what's interesting here is that the 4, 6, and 8 are hours of time in bed. They're not hours of time asleep. And that's really important because obviously people don't fall asleep within a minute and then sleep right until the alarm, not even in this study when they're very sleep deprived. So the 8-hour group got about 7.5 hours to 7.25, meaning they were missing about 30 to 45 minutes of sleep on average a night. And what you can see is that they're still doing quite well for about the first 6 nights, but then that little bit of sleep deprivation is starting to impact their performance in that second week. Okay, so what's the take-home message here? Well, firstly, 1 or 2 bad nights of sleep we can cope with quite okay. Sure, we're a little impacted, but not too much if we're getting at least 4 hours of sleep. But it's really the accumulated effects that count. So the sleep deprivation that's building up over time that is impacting us. So the other interesting thing that Hans van Dongen did in his study is that all the participants were blinded to their own performance. They had no idea how they were performing. But then at the end of the 14 days, he asked them, the 4 and the 6 hour group, so, how's it going? And objectively, of course, we know that they're performing horribly. But when we ask them this question, they say, oh, I'm fine. And this is really, really important because this tells us that when people are objectively performing really horrible, they're kind of relying on their subjective feeling of sleepiness to say how much they're impacted. And these people weren't feeling that subjectively sleepy. So they said, oh, I'm fine. I think everything's going well. But actually, we see that that's a really poor predictor of our objective performance. Okay, so on to some tips for you. I'm going to say a little bit more about quality, relaxation, and the timing of sleep. So first of all, a little bit more about healthy sleep quality. If you have a sleep tracker, you might have seen an image like this, which is called a hypnogram. The first thing I want to point out is that it's very normal for it to take up to 30 minutes for you to fall asleep. In fact, if you fall asleep within like 1 minute, that's actually a sign that you have a pretty high sleep debt and that you would really benefit from going to bed a bit earlier. And by the way, with this, I mean the time after lights out. So if you have a phone by your bed, which I hope you don't, but after you've put your phone away, after you've switched the lights off and you really want to try to fall asleep, it's normal for it to take a while. And then we see that most of the deep sleep is there in the first half of the night. And remember how I told you that if you have a high sleep debt, I would recommend you to go to bed a bit earlier. And why I'm saying that is that if you go to bed a bit earlier than you're used to, we see that people get a higher amount of deep sleep. So this is like a really good way to kind of get that high quality sleep a bit more. And then the other thing is that it's very normal to wake up at night. Even multiple times a night is actually quite normal if you can fall back asleep within about 5 to 10 minutes. So don't stare at the clock to time this in any way. But it's very normal. It doesn't mean that you have a sleep problem. So don't worry. And then we see that we have most of the rapid eye movement sleep or dream sleep in the second half of the night. And as I already said, ideally we wake up without an alarm. So a natural awakening. We wake up when our brain is ready with all the processes that it has been running all night. So here's a quick tip. If you want to boost your sleep quality, please don't snooze. So I'd love to see a show of hands of people who love snoozing in the morning. So this is hitting your alarm multiple times in the morning before you get out of bed. Yeah, I see quite some snooze lovers are in the room. So let me explain to you why I'm not recommending you to snooze. It's because our brain really prefers consolidated sleep. So sleep without awakenings, particularly not outside awakenings, such as an alarm. Because what we're doing when we're setting the alarm is that, for instance, if our brain is in, REM sleep, it's a very different brain state from being awake, by the way. So different chemicals and different neural activity. When the alarm goes off, we're basically, pulling on our brain and saying, wake up, wake up. And then our brain wakes up. And it's like, okay, here we go. And then you're telling your brain, just kidding, go back to sleep. And then your brain wants to start a whole new sleep cycle of, another 90 minutes, not knowing there's going to be another alarm immediately after. So that is not a good way to use those last minutes of what could have been consolidated sleep. You're kind of mushing it up by these different alarms. So what's my recommendation? Set your alarm as late as possible. And then when it goes off, try to get vertically immediately. So you can sit up or you can stand next to your bed. That's going to give you a bit of a cortisol boost and that's going to help you to wake up. Another good tip is to get a wake up light alarm clock. So this is a special alarm clock with a really bright light. And this bright light will also help you wake up and get energized when you get up in the morning. So then the other thing that very often impacts our sleep quality is stress. And for most people, their day kind of looks like this. They wake up in the morning, they're busy, 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 busy. They don't really take any breaks. Their stress levels continue to increase. And then only when they stop working might these stress levels decrease a little bit. But then they're still really high when they go to bed. And then when they go to bed with these high stress levels, it leads to poor quality sleep at night. So it can be disrupted sleep, can be lighter sleep. But then this disrupted or lighter sleep in and by itself makes us wake up in a much worse mood. So more anxious, more depressed. And you can see how we're setting us up in this negative spiral of more stress and even worse sleep and then even more stress. So how can we kind of turn this negative spiral around? Well, one way is to start working on our stress levels, right? If we can manage the stress curve and have lower stress levels in the evening, we're going to have much higher quality sleep. And then when we have this higher quality sleep, we can wake up in a much better mood, and not just better mood, but also more stress resilient, making it easier for the next night to have good sleep. So we recently did an analysis amongst clients at all the top companies in their industry, and we looked at really kind of the cream of the crop, meaning, about the best 5% of these people who have really low sleep debt, so max 1.5 hours, low stress levels, and great sleep quality. And we asked them, what are you doing to make this sustainable for yourself, being in this intense job? And first of all, I want to point out that a lot of people had rules, like they had thought about it. They had kind of a mantra to live by. And here's some examples of them. I mean, there's many, many more. But the common thread was really that people were really clear on boundaries. So boundaries, for instance, between their work and their private life. And this is really important because our brain can get confused, called boundary confusion, when we're starting to mix all these things together. Like, are we performing or are we recovering right now? And the more we can focus on recovery when we're not working, the better, for instance, relaxed we are and the higher our sleep quality is. But the other thing that we often notice is that people mentioned either mindfulness practices or meditation. So I actually want to do a quick meditation exercise with everyone right now, just to show you what the impact can be. So maybe find a quiet place or close the door, and we'll be right back.
This is a short 1-minute exercise that can be used to relax and refocus. It can be done anywhere, whether you're at home, on the train, or in your office. Sit with your feet planted firmly on the ground. Straighten your back and neck, but avoid clenching your muscles. Rest your hands on your knees, with your palms facing towards the ceiling. During the minute, focus your thoughts on your breath. Focus on how your body feels as the breath flows in and out of your body. One of the first things you'll quickly learn when trying this exercise is just how easily distracted the mind can be, even in the space of a minute. That's completely normal, and it doesn't mean that you're doing it wrong. If you notice this happening, acknowledge your thoughts, and then gently remind yourself to focus on your breathing once again. Okay, let's start. First, close your eyes and become mindful of your breathing. I will ring a bell at the start and at the end of the minute. Slowly come back to here and now. You can wiggle your toes and fingers for some energy. Slowly open your eyes when you're ready. Take a brief moment to notice how you feel right now.
Okay. Great. Well, I'd love for you to reflect in maybe just one word how that made you feel. Because if you enter that in the slider, we'll see a really nice word cloud with your responses. Okay, so relaxed, sleepy, peaceful, sleepy. I love it. And why I really like doing this exercise is that it's just 1 minute, right? It's super short, actually. And it shows you how quickly you can go to feeling calm or relaxed or sleepy. So can really recommend to think for yourself, like, what are like some short moments in the day where I could take some deep breaths or relax in another way if you didn't like this, but find a way to kind of change that curve across the day. And then the final thing I want to say a bit about is the timing of sleep. And we're all different. So we've got morning types, we've kind of in-between types, we've got strong evening types. And depending on our chronotype, we actually have quite a different day. So for the morning types, for instance, they have their peak analytical hours in the morning. Then after their afternoon dip, they're more creative. Then they get kind of a second wind of energy and then starts their wind down window. And so this not only impacts when your optimal sleep times are, but also what your ideal day would look like in terms of when you're creative or when you're analytical. And we help our clients to kind of find out their own chronotype and what their own perfect day looks like. So that also as a team, you can become more mindful of, kind of what phase everybody is in at a different time of day and decide, when do you want to have your social team meeting or when do you want to have your brainstorming session? So the interesting thing about our chronotype is that it determines our circadian rhythm. But our circadian rhythm can also be boosted. And the most impactful factor there is light. So the more bright light we can get during the day, the stronger our circadian rhythm is and the more energy we have during the day and the better we can sleep at night. But we actually want to decrease the intensity of light in the evening, already 3 hours before we go to bed. And I realize how difficult that is right now, for instance, in the Netherlands with really, really long days. And then we want complete darkness at night. And this dimming of the light we need in the evening to start producing melatonin, which is our sleep hormone. But we also see other ways that we can boost our rhythm. So for instance, if you're physically active first thing in the morning, you can boost this rhythm. If you're an owl, you probably hate this, but you can also exercise between 1 to 4 p.m. and you'd still boost your rhythm. But also eating is an important time cue. And we see that if people don't eat in the 3 to 4 hours before they go to bed, they can boost their rhythm and they can have much higher quality sleep. And then finally, temperature, our core body temperature is another important factor. So in the evening, our core body temperature drops, which helps us feel sleepy, and that helps us fall asleep. So if you're too hot in the evening, that prevents us from falling asleep. And then it can actually help to take a warm shower briefly before you go to bed, which will dilate your blood vessels and help you decrease your core body temperature. But is all of this worth it to start improving your sleep? Yes. So I've worked with many different organizations. And first of all, I've seen that we can actually decrease sleep debt. So for instance, at Logitech, we decreased it by 46%. But we can also see that when we improve sleep debt, other things improve. So at McKinsey, we increased performance by 21%. At PwC, we reduced stress levels by 30%. And of course, these are all interconnected. If you improve your sleep, you improve your performance, and you reduce your stress levels. So with that, I want to say thank you for dialing in. Through this QR code, you can follow me online. I also have a monthly newsletter. The next one is going to be about the impact of the timing of your exercise on your sleep. And the one after that is going to be about supplements. I'll also share the top tips slides afterwards, which Romee will send out. And then we also have a special QR code and link that will also be in that email for new parents, because we have a special parent support package with videos on how to, get your baby to sleep, for instance, in the first year, or how to survive yourself in that first year. So very happy to share that with you. And we can move to the Q&A.
Yes, Els, thank you so much for all of your information that you've shared in this masterclass about sleep. A lot of questions have come in, so we'll get started right away on them.
Great.
The most popular question that was asked today was one by Rona, and she said, is there a difference in sleep time between men and women?
So that's a really interesting question. So let me first start with the difference in sleep timing across our lifetime. So as you probably could guess, is that kids are really strong morning types on average. And then as they become teenagers, they're becoming really strong evening types. So they're really switching. And this is why teenagers, don't want to go to bed early, don't want to wake up, especially on the weekend. And then when we are kind of in our mid-20s, we start to slowly decrease again in terms of the sleep timing. So we become earlier and earlier again. And this kind of actually continues for a really long time, which is why, we often joke that grandparents, have dinner at 4 or 5 p.m. I'm a really strong morning type, and I love having dinner at 5 p.m.
It's also very Dutch.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what we kind of see, across the ages. But then if you look at genders, you see that this switch back to morning types comes a little earlier for women than it does for men. And we also see that after the menopause, women are on average an hour earlier than they were before the menopause. And that's kind of an acceleration compared to men in that same age window. And that's really important, because if you don't adjust your lifestyle to that, you're quite suboptimal. So if you still continue to go to bed at the late time, you're just going to wake up earlier and earlier and kind of lose out on sleep, of course. So ideally, you really kind of adjust with that and go to bed a bit earlier.
And also super interesting to see that it changes also throughout your life. So
Yes.
when you were once, you're like, oh, I'm always a morning person. Well, it can also just change based on your hormones, based on your age.
Yeah.
It's also interesting to keep track of that with yourself.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not completely set in stone. So, of course, you know this, right? Like if you travel to another continent, at some point you're changing your rhythm, and we switch about an hour every 24 hours with that. And the biggest factor there is light, for instance, but also because we eat at different times. So we can move that circadian rhythm a bit, particularly through light and the timing of it. So if you're a really strong morning type, but you've got to live as a morning type, then you can, for instance, use light and switch a bit. But it'll never be your preferred rhythm.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
We're going to dive into the next question by Paulo. And he asks, how much does food influence the amount of sleep? Obviously, caffeine late at night is a no-go, but what about chocolate, sweets, alcohol? Any specific recommendations regarding food at dinner time for better sleep? And what's the cutoff time for food in the evening? Lots of questions in one.
Yeah, lots of questions in one. So first of all, it's good to say that a healthier diet is associated with better sleep. And healthier diet, it's usually the Mediterranean diet, as they call it, that they look at in studies. So lots of whole foods, no processed foods, healthy oils, lots of fish, like no red meat. Yeah, I think that's probably it, like in a nutshell. And nuts.
Lots of nuts, yeah.
So that's kind of like a healthy diet. And we see that the healthier people eat, the better they sleep, right? Like in big correlational studies. We also see, of course, that sleep has a really big impact on how people eat. So if they have poor sleep, their dietary choices start to decrease, and they find like the same sweet food much sweeter and prefer that much more when they're tired. So again, we see this bidirectional relationship. But in general, the healthier you can eat, the better your sleep will be. Then in terms of the timing, I would say really don't eat in the 3 to 4 hours before bed. Try saying this in Spain, which I have, which is very difficult, but it really, really helps with the sleep quality. So we now basically see more of these studies that show that when we eat food in a shorter amount of time, which is called intermittent fasting, we see that we can see a lot of health benefits. We definitely need more research on women, and if that's such a good idea for women to, for instance, also start later in the morning. But we definitely see that it's very healthy to not eat in the 3 to 4 hours before bed. And when I say healthy, I mean your circadian rhythm is boosted, your sleep is boosted, but also things like glucose metabolism. We, for instance, see that the more people eat in the evening, the more they eat the next day. Then in terms of what to eat, so you were already, smart there with the caffeine. So caffeine has a really long half-life, and lots of people say, oh yeah, no caffeine in the evening. I would actually say no caffeine at least 10 hours before you go to bed. If you're on hormones as a woman, you might even have to increase that because the half-life doubles when you're on hormones. So you can become much more sensitive to caffeine. Whereas when you're a smoker, the half-life actually decreases by 50%. So this is all dependent on how your liver is processing these things. But in general, you really want that long window between caffeine and going to sleep. I would say the same thing actually for alcohol. So alcohol has this really negative impact on our sleep quality. Even though in the beginning it kind of relaxes you, it can help you fall asleep faster. We see that once the alcohol is out of our bloodstream, we go into withdrawal, and we see that actually our body is being stimulated, and that our heart rate increases, our heart rate variability decreases, we have more awakenings, we have much more restless sleep. Alcohol does not help your sleep, basically on the contrary. And we even see that when we drink alcohol in the evening, it can still impact our cognitive performance the next day. So it really can have quite long-lasting effects on sleep. And then the same thing, by the way, for chocolate as what I said for caffeine, right? So or nicotine, right? These are all stimulants. That can then all have because they're stimulating our body, saying like, stay active,
do things.
Maybe we're even a bit unsafe, right? We should be ready to fight or flight. So I would say that's kind of it in general. So in general, healthy eating, avoiding things like, stimulants like chocolate, caffeine, nicotine. I would say at least, at least for the caffeine, about 10 hours before you go to bed.
Yeah. So avoiding, stimulants basically, and everything that spikes you in some sort of way.
Yeah.
Also, very interesting what you said about the bidirectional interaction, and that it basically that the sugar also tastes sweeter and different if you're running on low sleep. It's super interesting.
Yeah. It's really interesting where they've done these really great studies where they really make the fluids like identical in terms of how they feel and what they look like, etc. And then you see that people rate it as, much sweeter, much preferable when they're tired. And they just choose the unhealthier foods when tired.
Yeah, very interesting. Then there's also a question by Barry, and he asks, some days I sleep 6 hours and feel great, waking up well before my alarm. Other days, having slept 8 hours until my alarm feels like too little. What does this tell me about my sleep depth?
Yeah, so it would tell me that you, have quite some variability in your sleep. Whereas ideally, we have very consistent sleep, meaning, we go to bed around the same time, we wake up around the same time. And actually, particularly this wake up time is quite important to keep kind of steady and anchored, because then your circadian rhythm is steady and anchored and will, keep you strong. So on the days that, you feel fine actually after just 6 hours of sleep, what's often happened is that you don't start that night with a high sleep debt. So maybe you've actually reduced your sleep debt quite a bit. And then you see that you can be quite resilient, right? Like one night of shorter sleep is fine. And particularly in this case also, if you wake up at your same time, right? So if you always wake up at the same time, you have hormones that basically help you in the morning, give you energy, and give you that push, even if you've had a shorter night of sleep. But what happens is that when you are building up the sleep debt, a lot of people think that, one longer night is supposed to make them feel already amazing the next day. But often it doesn't, because often when you build up a sleep debt, one longer night is not enough to recover. And there's now more and more studies that show that if, for instance, you don't sleep enough during the week, as we saw many of you on a Friday sleep debt, that 2 nights of recovery sleep on the weekend is not enough, right? And you can look at all these different indicators like your immune system functioning, your glucose metabolism, your cognitive performance, your mood. And we see that for almost all of those dimensions, we need more than 2 nights to fully get back to baseline. So, then you might have slept 8 or 9 hours on Friday night, and then on Saturday, you still don't feel that great, despite sleeping more than you usually do.
Yeah, so it takes a lot longer actually to get back to that.
Yeah.
So it's better to then just try to change your base, basically.
Yeah, exactly. So as you saw, right, like your brain is keeping track of the sleep debt. So the more consistent you can be, the more resilient you are. So to give you an example, I had a birthday party Saturday night, and I slept only 3.5 hours that night. So we came home late, and there was a baby waking me up at 6:15, or not a baby, but like a kid of my friend. But because I have a very strong circadian rhythm, I woke up and I actually felt quite energized, and I knew I'd feel quite energized in the morning. So I exercised, we all hang out. But then I took a recovery nap in the afternoon, and I slept like an hour and a half. Then, of course, you're a little groggy waking up, and you need to give yourself some energy. And I went outside. I saw another friend, and I went to bed on time yesterday. And I'm definitely not fully back to baseline. So tonight I'll also prioritize getting my sleep. But I'm quite resilient because I didn't start that weekend with a sleep debt, right? I was very mindful, like, okay, Saturday night is going to be short night. I'm going to be more mindful the nights leading up to it. So we call that sleep banking, where you're kind of preparing for a rough night or a rough week.
Yeah, so also being conscious about that in the process.
Yeah, because you see that when you go into such a sleep challenge, well rested, you recover much faster than you do when you start it with a bit of sleep debt already. So it really compounds on each other.
Yeah, so that's a good one to make sure that you're always close to that baseline at least, or prepare when you're not. Then we're already going into the last question of today, because I know you have a flight to catch as well. And that one is by Suranne. And she asks, is taking something like magnesium or melatonin beneficial in helping achieve better sleep? I think this is also personal, but...
so magnesium, only if you have a shortage. Basically with any supplements, I mean, we're going to write a newsletter on supplements for June, so keep in mind. But in general, with supplements, it's often the case that it's only helpful if you really have a shortage. So ideally, you would get a blood test and make sure that whatever shortage you use, you need to fix. And then I would actually particularly look at iron, particularly for women who often actually have low iron without knowing it, and causing a lot of fatigue and can also create sleep problems. So it was magnesium or?
Melatonin.
Melatonin. Yeah, so melatonin is interesting because it works on your biological clock, which means that you can shift your rhythm earlier or later, making it ideal to help you with jet lag. And in most cases, I would say melatonin isn't needed to fix sleep problems. Instead, I would look at cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, so CBTI, as a kind of the preferred method of changing your behavior, changing how you think about sleep, and then improving your sleep. But we do see that with aging, our melatonin levels start to decrease. And for instance, there are now studies that show that women going through menopause can benefit from melatonin. So, I wish we would have more research that is more clear at when is melatonin great, when is it not. There's not a lot of reason to not try melatonin, but you want to have it at the right time. You want to take it at the right dosage, and for that, you do often want to speak to a doctor to make sure that you're doing that in the right way. But if I have a jet lag, then I'll definitely use it to help switch my rhythm back or forth.
Yeah. Okay, that's good to know. So the magnesium and also the iron, then for women, and then a little bit more careful also. Melatonin.
Yeah. And of course, there are regular things like vitamin D, which many people are deficient in.
Els, thank you so much for all of the information you've shared. I think we could talk about this for another hour, but we unfortunately don't have the time. For everyone at home, in the handout to this to Lifetime, you can find basically all the tips that Els gave today. And there's also a link to additional videos, especially also for young parents. So if you're struggling with having your baby go to sleep, it's of course a whole different topic. So we also have some content for you on that. Els, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for everyone at home. I hope you enjoy some good nights and have a great rest of your Monday. Thank you.